working away through our book here, The Infallible Word, and we are in the chapter by Dr. Skilton on the transmission of the Scriptures. The chapter begins on page 141, but we're on page 187 today. So we are drawing towards the conclusion of his consideration of textual criticism. And I have an ambitious goal, which probably won't be realized, but I'd like to try to finish this up today. So we'll move as quickly and yet as hopefully profitably as possible here as we go through this. You recall that Dr. Skilton has made some consideration to the scholarship of Westcott and Hort and their understanding of the New Testament. And we saw that they developed a genealogical view of the transmission of the Greek New Testament, where you can trace the development of New Testament texts along different family lines, and made the point that the great number of copies of a particular text does not make the original text any more authoritative than another copy that does not have that same number of, or another manuscript does not have the same number of copies behind it. And so what counts is the original fount of that line of copies that we're looking at. So you can pretty well locate those original manuscripts into four basic areas. And the nomenclature changes from one scholar to the next. We're going to see that occurs here as we get into more recent developments on textual criticism. There'll be some different ways of categorizing these things. So with any science, there's always sometimes a different way of looking at things, a recharacterization of things. We saw that earlier Westcott and Hort came to the conclusion of four basic text types. The Syrian text type, which was also others named as the Byzantine or Constantinople text, and some other Textus Receptus, the majority text, that kind of name comes along with the Syrian text type that Westcott and Hort identify. Then they identify three other text types: the Western, the Neutral, and the Alexandrian, based on locations of where the texts originated. And they felt that the Neutral text type was the most authoritative, as it is the most ancient and reliable of the different texts. And they characterized the Western and Alexandrian text types according to the style of copying. And some styles are more florid, more expansive. Some are include insertions into the text and that sort of thing. So you have to know the character of each text type, and that helps you to form a judgment on the reliability of that particular text when there is a textual variant that we need to decide on. So those are the four basic text types that Westcott and Hort identify. We're going to see that as we go along here, there's going to be a little bit of a reconfiguration. The idea of a neutral text type drops out and becomes the Alexandrian text type. And so these are the kinds of things that you can work on. Let's get started on page 187. And we have a few things to finish up on with Westcott and Hort, and then go from there. We read, in arriving at a final decision on readings, Westcott and Hort do not wish to neglect any type of evidence, including internal evidence of readings. So, as we've been making the point for quite some time now, seems to me a scholarly approach to the New Testament text tradition is to include the whole manuscript tradition into your evaluation and not focus on just one stream of that textual history. Include the whole thing and use that as a way of focusing on hopefully the original text of the New Testament. It's kind of like having the idea that two eyes are better than one. Even if there are differences and if there are inferior texts, the whole body of these manuscripts do help us to focus more exactly on the original text rather than just trying to look at the original text through one eye and limit ourselves in that way. It's just not as effective or as helpful. So include all the texts that we have available and include the internal evidence of readings. So that's going to be each particular text and the way that it characterizes readings, or the way that it's reliable in terms of its readings. So here's a quote from Hort, which is, I think, from the introduction to the Greek New Testament. He writes, "The aim of sound textual criticism must always be to take account of every class of textual facts and to assign to the evidence supplied by each class its proper use and rank. When once it is clearly understood that by the very nature of textual transmission, all existing documents are more or less closely related to each other, and that these relations of descent and affinity have been the determining causes of nearly all their readings, the historical investigation of general and partial genealogy becomes the necessary starting point of criticism. Genealogical results, taken in combination with the internal character of the chief ancient texts or of the texts of extant documentary groups, supply the presumptions, stronger or weaker, as the case may be, which constitute the primary and often the virtually decisive evidence for one reading as against another. Before, however, the decision as to any variation is finally made, it is always prudent and often necessary to take into consideration the internal evidence specially affecting it, both intrinsic and transcriptional. If it points to a result different from that which the documentary evidence suggested, a second and closer inspection will usually detect some hitherto overlooked characteristic of the best attested reading, which might naturally lead to its alteration. While sometimes, on the other hand, re-examination brings to light an ambiguity in the attestation. No definite rule can be given in the comparatively few cases in which the apparent conflict remains, more especially where the documentary evidence is scanty on one side or obscure. The ultimate determination must evidently be here left to personal judgment on a comprehensive review of the whole evidence. But in a text so richly attested as that of the New Testament, it is dangerous to reject a reading clearly recommended by documentary evidence, genealogically interpreted, though it is by no means always safe to reject the rival reading." Okay, that's quite a mouthful, and it might have been a little bit difficult to follow what he was saying. But he's discussing what he calls the genealogical approach to the textual transmission of the New Testament, the family trees. And so you have one genealogy descending from the Syrian text. That's the Byzantine majority text type. And you have the original, the earliest text that we can figure out, and then the copies of that going from there. And within that family of texts, you have a certain measure of reliability for some texts as opposed to others. Some are more reliable and faithful to the original than others. And then there's variation between them. And so within that genealogy, you have to determine with the evidence where the variant reading needs to be corrected. And so you take into account the genealogy, the origin and development of that particular text. And then you also take into account the other families of texts that come along the way with their own connections and corrections and so forth. And you stack these up in terms of their reliability. Which family is the more authoritative? Which is the more consistent? And when you have then a question on a particular reading of a text, you have these four basic text types, and you're working off of them. And you find that, for example, the neutral or the Alexandrian text type with its Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, these ancient texts are most reliable. And so when there's a variation between all of the texts, your inclination is to follow that most reliable text as being the authoritative reading, and the others, the variant readings off of that, as being less reliable. It doesn't mean that you disregard the other texts and just follow the more reliable text all the time. You still have to take them all into consideration and make a judgment. But you determine the authority of the text, and that helps you, gives you a presumption with regard to what is the more likely reading for the text. And so hopefully that helps to guide you in that way. And that simply makes a lot of sense if you're following a text type that is known to have a number of variations and mistakes along the way, and is not a recent, or excuse me, is a more recent text and not an ancient text. Well, then you're going to give more credence, more authority to the older text type that as you're reading it in comparison with the others, you're seeing that it is the reliable text type along the way, and so you follow after that. But in the end, you may come to a point, and this is where the paragraph ends, you may come to the point where you don't quite know which of the four readings, if there are that many different readings, which of the variant readings is the more likely of them, because there might be problems with even the original, the earliest manuscripts. And at that point, you have to make your own subjective judgment. This is where Hort ends up. You kind of have to make a judgment one way or the other, and there's a degree of subjectivity, but it's inescapable. You have to kind of make a choice. And more than likely, because of the authority of the older manuscripts, you're probably going to follow that manuscript as you make that choice. But sometimes you kind of, you might not do that. Here's Skilton's comment on that so far. This rather long quotation will give a clear impression of the way in which Westcott and Hort would apply their theories to the actual practice of textual criticism. And surely the consistent application of such principles as they advocate will make a good measure of justifiable assurance possible in many of our decisions. So he's given his stamp of approval to the approach that Westcott and Hort are following here. He continues, in some few cases, recourse may be had to conjectural emendation to remove what would seem to be errors in the best text at which we can otherwise arrive. Some errors entered the stream of transmission at a very early date and are found or reflected in all our extant documents. Such conjectural corrections as are made should be able to claim strong support from intrinsic and transcriptional evidence. Now remember what intrinsic and transcriptional evidence is. That's the evidence of what the author most likely would have said in a particular text, or what a copyist most likely would have copied into the text, maybe inserted into the text or withheld from the text as he was reading it, perhaps without the benefit of properly understanding the original text in its context. And so this kind of evidence, what the author would most likely put in there, and then what the copyist would most likely add or subtract from the text because he thinks that's the more likely solution to a problem that he sees in the text, that kind of information helps us make that judgment with regard to a situation where we're looking at a text and it seems like there's an error here, but we can't quite figure out where it's at in terms of the manuscript evidence. And it sounds to me like Skilton is talking about situations where perhaps all of the manuscripts basically agree on a particular reading, but in looking at that reading, it just seems to be wrong. It just seems to be something out of place there. And so the suggestion is here that you can have a situation where all of the copies that we have were wrong at a particular point, even when they all agreed. And so that creates a very difficult decision to make. And I'm inclined from a conservative judgment to say that, well, you need to be very, very careful about amending the text under those circumstances where there's not real evidence. It may simply be much like the copyists of long ago. They haven't properly understood the text, and therefore they made an addition or a change which really wasn't warranted. And we need to caution ourselves against making that kind of change to a text where all of the manuscripts are in agreement, but we look at something and say, this just can't be right. There's an apparent contradiction. Perhaps maybe there's a numerical difference in the New Testament, quoting from an Old Testament text saying there were 30,000 men at the battle, whereas there were 29,000 in the New Testament account. Okay, what's the issue there? Well, the issue may not be a textual issue. It may be simply the intention of the author to give a round number and not an exact number, and the number itself didn't mean a whole lot. So you need to be very, very careful, it seems to me, in making a change under those circumstances. Continuing here, well, let's look at a footnote at the bottom of page 188. It has a helpful comment by B.B. Warfield on that subject. He says that there are two sensible rules for conjectural emendation. First, critical conjecture is not to be employed in settling the text of the New Testament until all the methods of criticism have been exhausted, and unless clear occasion for its use can be shown in each instance. Second, no conjecture can be accepted unless it perfectly fulfill all the requirements of the passage as they are interpreted by intrinsic evidence, and also perfectly fulfill all the requirements of transcriptional evidence in accounting for the actual reading, and if variants exist also for them, either directly or immediately through one of their number. The dangers of the process are so great that these rules are entirely reasonable and indeed necessary. The only test of a successful conjecture is that it shall approve itself as inevitable. Lacking inevitableness, it remains doubtful. So again, the idea is be extremely cautious about making any changes based on conjecture alone. You need to have a significant problem, an obvious problem that needs an inevitable solution, and there's no other solution available in the manuscript evidence. And that's where you might consider making that adjustment. Skilton makes the further comment that Westcott and Hort think that, quote, the history of the text of the New Testament shows the meeting point of the extant lines of transmission to have been so near the autographs that complete freedom from primitive corruption would not be antecedently improbable. As far as we are able to judge, the purity of the best transmitted text does in all essential points receive satisfactory confirmation from internal evidence. So what he's saying is that, our oldest manuscripts that are closest to the originals may nonetheless yet have some errors in them because they are copies, fallible copies of the original text. So we have to be aware of that there's that possibility. That being said, the corruption is so minimal, the variance is so minimal as to, again, be of no significance in terms of the meaning of the text and what God has to say to us. Okay, top of page 189. The views of Westcott and Hort met with strong opposition from John William Bergen, Dean of Chichester, and Edward Miller, Wickhamical Prebendary of Chichester, who argued on unsatisfactory grounds for the received text. Remember, that was the text that you got Erasmus, and then what was the next one? The publisher made the note that they received the text that was there before them was the text that's been received by the church, and that became known as the Textus Receptus, the Byzantine text type, the majority text type. That's been considered to be the received text, and so this is what Bergen and Miller are arguing for, that text which was the foundation for the King James Version of the Bible. And so they're arguing for that as opposed to the more ancient texts. Some modifications of their views of the pre-Syrian types of text have been suggested by later scholars in light of new information. So Bergen and Miller wrote, I think, around the turn of the 20th century. I'll have to check that later on for you. But some modifications have developed in their point of view by other scholars, and Skilton continues, the scope of this paper prohibits any extensive treatment of the developments in the textual criticism of the New Testament since their time. It should be remarked, however, that advances have been made in the discovery of manuscripts, the publication and study of texts, and that much attention has been given by scholars to the theory of textual criticism. Among manuscripts discovered or brought to the attention of the world of scholarship since Hort's day are the Sinaitic manuscript of the Old Syriac version, the Washington manuscript of the Gospels, the Washington manuscript of the Pauline epistles, the Corinthi Codex, and the papyri manuscripts, among them the Chester Beatty and the Bodmer papyri, which have previously been mentioned. We won't need to look into those texts for our purposes today. Much attention has been given to the text which Hort called Western. The question of its merit as compared with the neutral text has been debated, and its claim to homogeneousness has been tested. Professor Kersop Lake has done much in the distinguishing of an important family to which Canon B.H. Streeter, who has also made a valuable contribution to the study of the subject, gave the name Caesarean. So again, we're working on the names of these texts. The Caesarean text is, I think, a new name for the Western text, at least in Streeter's classification. Streeter gave a clear statement of his views on the text in his book, The Four Gospels. He holds that at an early time, distinctive texts were to be found in various localities, texts which later gave way to the Byzantine Standard text, Hort's Syrian text. So Hort called it Syrian. More recently, it's been called Byzantine. He believes that the Codex Vaticanus and the Codex Sinaiticus are representative of the text of Alexandria. He would apply the term Alexandrian to that local text and drop the term neutral. He breaks up the Western family of Hort into an Eastern class and a Western class with subdivisions in each, with the Caesarean text forming a subdivision of the Eastern class. In some points of theory, he is not in full agreement with Hort, as when he asserts that the, quote, eclectic principle of deciding in each separate case on grounds of internal probability what appears to be the best reading is, in spite of its subjectivity, theoretically sounder than the almost slavish following of a single text which Hort preferred. So Streeter is saying that in contrast to Hort, that generally followed the more ancient texts, Streeter says you still need to make use of a subjective judgment, and sometimes that judgment is to be preferred to just a slavish reading of that older text. And continuing, and when he maintains that the authorities available for determining the text are more numerous and more independent of one another than Hort realized, and that though on minor points of reading absolute certainty may often be unobtainable, a text of the Gospels can be reached, the freedom of which from serious modification or interpolation is guaranteed by the concurrence of different lines of ancient and independent evidence. Again, another mouthful. These guys don't believe in short sentences. They've not followed the Fletch reading skills for reducing things down into more bite-sized elements here. But what Streeter is arguing for is that we shouldn't slavishly follow the more ancient texts, but be sensitive to what some of the vast majority of texts have to say. And Streeter's point is that Westcott and Hort did not fully appreciate the breadth and diversity within the majority text types that have come down to us, and the more independent readings within those broader texts. And so therefore, that also needs to be taken into account and, again, form the judgment. So you can see scholarship is kind of going back and forth, and trying to sort through various arguments that help us to identify the original reading of the text of the New Testament. And there will be different views of that from different scholars based on the accumulation of evidence. So Streeter is writing after Westcott and Hort, after various texts and manuscripts have been discovered beyond what Westcott and Hort were aware of. Okay, so Skilton continues, but despite his differences with Hort, Streeter believes that a critical text of the Gospels, though not of Acts, will be based in the main on his Alexandrian type of text as found in the Codex Vaticanus and the Codex Sinaiticus. That the Alexandrian text, which is similar, of course, to Hort's neutral, is the best of the local texts, and that the Textus Receptus is to be rejected. He acknowledges that due weight must be given to Hort's principle that the authority of a manuscript, which in a majority of cases supports what is clearly the right reading, counts for more than that of others in cases where decision is more difficult, and believes that the text of Westcott and Hort is satisfactory for most purposes. So Streeter, despite his cautions, does align himself more directly with Hort's conclusions that Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are the more authoritative texts. They're more ancient, more reliable, and therefore, when there's a dispute between Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and the Textus Receptus, for example, the nod should be given to Sinaiticus and Vaticanus because of the authority that's found in that text type and the development of that particular text as compared to the Textus Receptus and the variations in readings that you have in that collection of manuscripts. Continuing, Streeter's endorsement of an eclectic principle that's gathering all different kinds of texts, and indeed not just the manuscript tradition, but also the lectionaries, the sermons, the books by different authors and their quotations of text. So all of this evidence comes into view, and not just the manuscript evidence. This eclectic principle of textual criticism by no means stands alone in the period since Westcott and Hort. G.D. Kilpatrick, for one, has called for a rigorous eclecticism. Those who chose the basic text for the Revised Standard Version of the New Testament followed an eclectic method. The Greek text, which underlies the New English Bible, New Testament, was likewise eclectically determined. The employment of eclectic or rational criticism will naturally differ with different scholars, but fundamentally it would give more weight to what Westcott and Hort called internal evidence of readings than to external evidence. In its most extreme form, it would ignore external evidence completely. So one thing I wanted to highlight here is that we've not only had in our scholarship in the advance of time an analysis of the various manuscripts and copies and translations and lectionaries and so forth, but we've also had the science of textual criticism itself come under review. That's an important point. It's not that these principles just kind of dropped out of the sky and everybody adopted them all at once, but different scholars have worked through these things, and there's been analysis, interaction, and development of the science of textual criticism, along with the increased number of manuscripts and information available for textual criticism. And this textual criticism is a kind of rationalism. It's a rational approach to various texts of the New Testament that we have descending down to us. And so this constant review and evaluation is ongoing. And despite that, this idea of an eclectic text, a Greek text that's formed on the basis of a review of all of the evidence in front of us, as much as we have, in all of its many permutations, that Greek manuscript that we finally end up with, which we believe most faithfully and accurately reflects the original text penned by the apostles of the New Testament and so forth, that text has been followed more recently in a variety of translations up in Skilton's day, including the Revised Standard Version, the New English Bible, and I would say beyond that, the English Standard Version, which we use at church, the New International Version, which we've used in the past, New American Standard Version. These make use of that eclectic text. And so there's been a tremendous widespread approval of this particular approach to arriving at our best judgment as to what the original Greek New Testament text was. Okay, continuing, the eclectic method, although still vulnerable to such criticism as Westcott and Hort leveled against it, need not, when carefully employed, yield results radically different from those which Westcott and Hort themselves obtained. Thus, Frederick C. Grant, a member of the revision committee which prepared the Revised Standard Version of the New Testament, says, quote, "It is really extraordinary how often, with the fuller apparatus of variant readings at our disposal, and with the eclectic principle now more widely accepted, we have concurred in following Westcott and Hort. Not that we agreed in advance in favor of Hort. Quite the contrary, there was no such unanimity. Our agreement is really a tribute to Westcott and Hort, which is still the great classical edition of modern times. Indeed, the general reliability of much in the approach of Westcott and Hort has not been lacking in support and recognition since their time. Where are we at in time? We're still good. Okay, so here, more recent scholars have differed with Westcott and Hort as to how they conduct their formulations and arrive at a Greek New Testament text, and yet the end result of these two different approaches, slightly different approaches, is they're very much the same. So in more recent days, where we have much more evidence to work off of, and we have a more widespread eclectic approach to things than what Westcott and Hort, who were generally following the more ancient texts, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, in spite of that, there's general agreement among them all as to what the New Testament text is. So the one approach helps to validate and confirm the other, and they mutually inform each other and support each other. We have occupied ourselves in the main with illustrating principles of textual criticism and their application to the text of the New Testament. The same principles, valid in the criticism of the New Testament text, will be valid in the criticism of the text of any other ancient work, the Old Testament included. Of course, in the case of the Old Testament, it is not very difficult to ascertain the text used by the Masoretes. A major problem, however, has to do with the extent to which the Septuagint is to be followed in the reconstruction of the original text. Dr. Green would accept the reading of the Septuagint when it differs from the received Hebrew text only if the Hebrew text were subject to doubt on other grounds. So there was a certain priority to the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, compared to the Septuagint Greek translation. And unless there were real problems, obvious problems with the Hebrew text there, you wouldn't defer to the Septuagint. It should be apparent that with the aid of textual criticism, we can obtain a text nearer to the original than that preserved in any one manuscript. In God's providence, men may glorify him by textual studies and may aid in the preservation of his word in a form of exceptional purity. Warfield expressed the conviction that in the Greek Testament of Westcott and Hort, we have, quote, substantially the autographic text, end quote. And that's the original text penned by Paul and Mark and so forth. We have substantially the autographic text, and that probably future criticism would not cast doubt on more than one word of it in 1,000. Further advances in the field of textual criticism should, of course, be made, whether one accepts Warfield's judgment completely or not. But we may take a considerable amount of satisfaction in the results that have been achieved and in the promise which future studies offer. Warfield has rightly said, if then we undertake the textual criticism of the New Testament under a sense of duty, we may bring it to a conclusion under the inspiration of hope. The autographic text of the New Testament is distinctly within the reach of criticism, and so immensely the greater part of the volume that we cannot despair of restoring to ourselves and the Church of God his book, word for word, as he gave it by inspiration to men. So again, a word of confidence that we have, through all of this process, we've come to a more exact understanding of the original documents as they were in their pristine clarity and purity. And so we are, ironically enough, at this late date and time, we are closer to the original perhaps than at any point since the copies of manuscripts have come down to us. That's kind of the point. We are just at a remarkable moment in history, and it's not that we're finished. There may yet be still more work that needs to be done, more discoveries, more manuscripts yet out there, perhaps, different things. But we can be extremely confident that we have that original text of the New Testament in its great fullness and essential purity. In view of the reasonable assurance that we may have with regard to the reliability and purity of the text of the Scriptures at which we are able to arrive, the statement made by Dr. Briggs, which was quoted at the beginning of this chapter, seems strange indeed. And this is Dr. Briggs' quote. If the external words of the original were inspired, it does not profit us. We are cut off from them forever. Interposed between us and them is the tradition of centuries and even millenniums. End quote. So Skilton says, God in his singular care and providence has manifestly caused his word to triumph over the hazards of time. Even if further progress is possible for us in textual criticism, even if at present some very small proportion of the words of the original may yet have to be established, words which affect no doctrine of the Scriptures, we should neither ignore nor despise the results which, in the providence of God, have been achieved. It is a matter of first importance that words of preeminent value, words inspired by God, have survived the ages and can address themselves to us today as they did to men centuries or even millenniums ago. And with that, Skilton concludes his consideration of the transmission of the New Testament. So I hope that that's been a very helpful study for you, and that you're able to kind of get a flavor, a feel for textual criticism, what's involved in it, the variety of manuscripts, the analysis of the manuscripts, the analysis of the method that we review these manuscripts, and then the assurance that we are really dead on, nearly exactly at what was originally given to us by the pen of the apostles, Peter, James, and so forth. So I hope that's helpful for you. James actually was not an apostle, at least not the one who wrote the book of James. He was the brother of the Lord.